This video is a continuation from the previous. So we have finally made it to elements of design. Welcome. I know I've been talking about it. Now we're finally going to get into it. So let's do that. If I could get to my slide. There we go. Didn't want to cooperate this morning. Okay, so as an overview, these are the 8 different elements of design that we're going to discuss. There are more. They are called different things. It's not while it's based on science. Now we're starting to get into the more opinion art side of it. Okay, so we're going to talk about points/dots, and as we know, points are these single instances in space that have no dimension, no area. They're technically invisible, but we know they exist. They're coordinate points. If you think of geometry, X, Y, Z, right? For us, we're in the 3-dimensional world. Those, if you plug numbers in those coordinates, say 3 minus 2, 8, and you plot that out, that is a point. But it has no depth, no width, no length, so technically you can't see it. However, in order to represent points, we use dots. And so dots end up becoming these focused points of attention. And we're going to talk about focal points. We're going to talk about subjects. And in a sense, dots represent those, though they may not be dots. Let's see. So points and dots are the most basic element, and they are the building blocks for everything else. So points make lines. Lines are a series of adjacent points. They're points in motion. So, the best way to describe this is that if you have a point and it starts, a dot, and it starts to move, and it leaves a trail behind it so that you see the dots that preceded it, that becomes a line. If you don't see it, it just moves, then you just see that dot. But what we're talking about is the continuous path. By definition, they have one dimension. They either have length, or they have width, or they have height. And in order to see them, we need 2 dimensions. We need an X and a Y and a Z, or an X and a Z. Okay. Dots are about focal points. You're attracting attention to a point. Lines are about movement and direction. And as we briefly discussed previously, lines may be there physically, or they may just be implied. And we'll talk more about that when we get to lines, because we're going to break all these down. This is just an overview. Okay, so then if points form lines, and lines, what do lines form? They form shapes, surfaces, and planes. We're going to use the term shapes to refer to surfaces, planes, and shapes. These are 2-dimensional objects. They are flat without any kind of depth. Well, I know that we say that because we talk about it in the X and the Y axis, but technically you can rotate that plane so that it is in the XZ axis, or rotate it so that it's in the YZ axis, and it becomes, it itself has no thickness. It might have depth. So let's just do that. I'm all about fixing stuff as we go. There we go. So technically it's flat without thickness. It has no mass, but we can see it because it has 2 dimensions. Okay, and so then shapes, planes, surfaces form volumes, masses, forms. We're going to use the term form. Shapes are 2D, forms are 3D. Okay, and so now we have X, Y, and Z coordinates for every form, volume, or mass that we use. Then texture. Texture evolves out of structure. We previously discussed this briefly, what structure was, and we looked at the scales of a fish as texture. Whenever you have two or more elements in a design, there's a structure between them. And those two elements can both be color, for instance. So if I have red circles and black circles and they overlap so that the black circles look like shadows, it starts to create a texture. It starts to make those red circles pop off the page because they are now in contrast to the black circles. And so it can also be the way you work with other elements together. But whenever you have two or more elements, it starts to form texture. And texture, as we're going to talk about in great detail, can be tactile where you touch it and you can feel it, or it can appear to look like it would be tactile if you touched it. The next one is space. Space connects and separates elements, and it's contrast that allows everything else to be seen and recognized. So we're going to talk about that. We're going to learn, we've kind of briefly covered that in Gestalt when we were showing that if we put objects further apart, it broke any kind of a relationship between them, even if they were similar. And we're going to get to working with that a little bit more. Color is how we see the reflection of light waves off the surfaces of objects. That is the best scientific definition I have ever heard for color that isn't impossible to understand. I have studied color quite a bit on the scientific spectrum because I'm just very curious about how it works. Because here's the reality, and this came as a big shock to me when I found out. We see color, but it's an illusion. Color doesn't exist. Everything is without color. We see color because our brains interpret light waves that hit our retinas to be informational. And if you think about it, if you looked out into our environment and you could not see color, how would you know what to eat when you're out there living in it? Because we used to be. We creating our own environments where we live inside these man-made caves. I mean, that's what houses can be, right? That's what they are. But just think about it. If you look down on a landscape and you were supposed to go pick dinner and nothing had color, how would you identify it? And so our brains, because it was evolutionarily successful to our ancestors, their brains that were able to see color survived and passed that on to their offspring. And so now not everybody sees color. Not everybody sees. It's hard to make generalizations, but it's hard to talk with caveats. So let me put it this way. Most humans see, and most humans see color. And that's what we're talking about when we're talking about color. Those who can perceive color our brains are differentiating the difference in the light waves that hit that object and bounce off. And we interpret that. And insects see more colors than we do. They see a broader range. They can see infrared and ultraviolet. And I'm getting way ahead of myself because I get excited about this. So let's just say color is an illusion that our brains create to organize objects. And that's the truth. And I didn't write this. I borrowed this from someone else that I've referenced below. And that's the truth. That's exactly what happens. So we'll talk a great deal about that. And I'll show you some really cool things that we can use, that we've taken photos of infrared and ultraviolet objects with that reflect those lights. And you'll see that it changes. So color is just an illusion. It's very cool. Also mind bending to find when you first find out that it's not real. Whoops, I just clicked the wrong thing there. Okay, and then value. When we talk about value, we're talking about, think about a gray scale from white to black on the shades of gray in between. That's what we're talking about. We're talking about the lightness to the darkness of an object. And this conveys meaning because it is what we need in order to see three dimensions. And it also has other values, and we'll talk about that when we get into that area. Okay, so what I'm going to do here is that's the overview of what we're going to do. I'm going to talk a little bit more and give you some examples for each one of these things, but we're also going to study them individually in more depth. So I'm doing big picture, and then we're going to go to the next level down, and then we'll go to the next level down, because creative minds, visual learners tend to work best, learn best, big picture down to the details. And so that's how I'm going to give you that information. Okay. And so we're going to cover them in this, but then we're going to break down further and cover them in additional lectures in chunks. I've chunked it out. Okay, actually, let's stop this one here, so that I don't end up going over my 15 minutes. It took a video yesterday that I went over, but I prefer to keep these under 15 minutes anyway, so that you all can watch them in 15-minute chunks or less than 15-minute chunks, so that you have time in between watching them to process what you've learned. Often we have you guys in a classroom, and we'll talk to you or at you or give you information for hours. And I find, for me, it doesn't work. And studies I've read, it doesn't work. It's best to absorb chunks of data and then take breaks in between to let your brain process, give your unconscious time to process what it's been given. Okay, so I'm going to stop this here, and we'll pick up going into more detail about these in the next video.